The Atlantic Ocean. 3 in the morning. No moon. 700 miles from the nearest coastline, a German U-boat sits on the surface in absolute darkness, charging its batteries. The only sounds are the diesel engines, the slap of waves against the hull, and the wind cutting across the conning tower. Below decks, in a space smaller than a modest bathroom, a 22-year-old radio operator named Klaus Berger sits at his equipment. Headset on, pencil ready, watching the static. He has been awake for 19 hours. His job tonight is simple. Send one message. A contact report. The convoy his captain has been stalking for 2 days is finally within striking range. Berger just needs to transmit the position, course, and speed to U-boat command in Lorient, France. A few dozen characters in Morse code, 20 seconds of transmission at most. He has done this dozens of times. He knows the procedure. Encode the message on the Enigma cipher machine. Transmit briefly. Shut down immediately. Never stay on the air longer than necessary. The British have direction-finding equipment. Everyone knows this. They can triangulate a transmission if you stay on long enough. 20 seconds is not long enough. He transmits. What Berger does not know, what he cannot possibly know, is that tonight is different. Tonight, the British have something new, something faster, something that can fix a position not in minutes, but in seconds. Tonight, Berger's 20-second transmission is the last mistake his Wolfpack will ever make. By morning, 7 U-boats will be hunted. By the end of the week, 4 of them will be on the bottom of the Atlantic. This is the story of how one radio message ended the Battle of the Atlantic. Chapter 1. How Dönitz built his underwater navy. To understand what Klaus Berger did wrong that night, you have to understand everything he had been taught was right. You have to go back to the beginning. Back to a time when the Atlantic truly belonged to the U-boats. When German submarines ranged freely across 3,000 miles of open ocean, sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them, killing men faster than the Allies could replace them. When a U-boat crew could complete a patrol, return to port, be received as heroes, decorated, photographed, sent on propaganda tours of German cities where schoolchildren pressed their faces against the glass of shop windows to see these young men in their leather coats and white-topped caps. When it was genuinely good to be in the submarine service. That time had a name. The Germans called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. Karl Dönitz believed in submarines with a religious intensity that most of his contemporaries found excessive. In 1935, when Adolf Hitler appointed him commander of the newly reformed U-boat arm, Dönitz was given almost nothing. A handful of vessels, a tiny budget, no respect from the surface fleet admirals who considered submarines a secondary weapon, unglamorous, the province of desperate men fighting desperate tactics in the dark below the surface. Dönitz didn't argue with them. He simply worked. He was 50 years old, lean, precise, with cold blue eyes and the manner of a man who had never in his adult life been entirely at rest. He had commanded submarines in the First World War, been captured when his boat was lost in the Mediterranean in 1918, spent months as a prisoner of war in Britain, and used that time to think, to plan, to develop ideas that would not be tested for another 20 years. The central idea was this: submarines should not fight alone. In the First World War, U-boats operated independently. They found a target, they attacked, they moved on. This worked well against unescorted merchant ships in the early years of the war. It stopped working the moment the British introduced the convoy system in 1917, grouping merchant vessels together under naval escort so that they were harder to find, harder to attack, and defended when found. The individual U-boat, stalking independently across the ocean, could no longer simply pick its moment and close the range. Now there were destroyers. Now there were depth charges. Now there were lookouts on every ship, watching every horizon. Dönitz's answer was elegant and brutal in equal measure. If a single submarine was insufficient against a defended convoy, use many submarines. Not one hunter, but a pack. Coordinate their movements through radio. Vector multiple boats onto a single target simultaneously. Overwhelm the escorts through numbers and confusion. Make the defenders choose which threat to pursue, while the others slipped inside the perimeter. He called the tactic Rudeltaktik, the Wolfpack. Chapter 2. The Machinery of the Wolfpack. The Wolfpack required specific things to function. It required submarines capable of operating across oceanic distances. Range was everything, and the Type 7 U-boats that formed the backbone of Dönitz's fleet had range measured in thousands of miles. They were not large boats by any standard. Crews of 40 to 50 men lived and worked in a steel cylinder roughly 67 meters long and 6 meters in diameter at its widest point. Inside that cylinder, there were torpedoes, engines, batteries, fuel tanks, food, weapons, navigation equipment, and 40 human beings who would not see natural light for weeks at a time. Everything smelled of diesel, bilge water, unwashed bodies, and mold. The food rotted after the first 2 weeks. Fresh bread gave way to crackers, which gave way to hardtack, which gave way to the desperate creativity of a cook working in a space barely large enough to turn around in. Vegetables grew green fur. Meat turned colors that had no name. The crew ate it anyway. They had to. They were 700 miles from shore with no alternative. But they stayed out. They endured it. Because the alternative, going home empty, was unthinkable when there were ships to sink and a war to win. The Wolfpack also required skilled radio operators, not just men who could tap Morse code, but men who understood the critical discipline of brevity. In submarine warfare, the radio was both the boat's lifeline and its greatest vulnerability. A transmission was a location. Stay on the air long enough, and the enemy's direction-finding equipment would fix your position as surely as a lighthouse. Every radio operator in the U-boat service was trained to be brief. Encode the message, transmit, stop. 20 seconds maximum, 30 at the absolute outside. And it required command infrastructure of a kind that had never existed in naval warfare before. Dönitz himself, operating first from L'Orient on the French Atlantic coast and later from Paris and Berlin, was the brain of the Wolfpack system. He received reports from boats at sea, position, sightings, contacts, weather, damage, fuel state, torpedo loads. He synthesized all of it in his operations room, where a team of staff officers tracked every submarine and every known convoy route on a massive plotting table. When a boat reported a convoy sighting, Dönitz acted as coordinator. He calculated approach routes. He vectored other boats into intercept positions. He issued attack orders. He orchestrated from shore a battle taking place in darkness on the open ocean hundreds of miles away. It was unprecedented in naval history. And for 3 years, from 1939 to 1942, it worked with devastating effectiveness. Chapter 3. The Enigma and the Illusion of Security. Every communication in the Wolfpack system passed through the Enigma cipher machine. The Enigma machine was a commercial encryption device developed in the 1920s, originally intended for banking and business. The German military had adopted it, extensively modified it, and by the outbreak of war had produced a version of such apparent mathematical complexity that its designers considered it effectively unbreakable. The naval Enigma, used by the U-boat service, was the most sophisticated variant of all. It used 4 rotors instead of the standard 3, a plug board with 20 interconnected letter pairs, and a set of procedures for daily key changes that meant the effective combination of possible settings ran into the hundreds of millions. To a naval officer in 1940, this looked like absolute security. And for a time, it was. The British code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, a rambling Victorian mansion in the English countryside, staffed by mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword puzzle enthusiasts, and the occasional brilliant eccentric, had been attacking German Enigma traffic since before the war began. They had made progress on the Army and Air Force variants. The naval variant, with its 4th rotor and stricter operating procedures, remained impenetrable, which meant that for the first 3 years of the war, Dönitz could communicate with his boats in what he believed was perfect secrecy. He could tell them where the convoys were. He could tell them where the patrol lines were. He could issue orders and receive reports and orchestrate the destruction of Allied shipping with the confidence of a man who knew his telephone line was untappable. He was wrong. But he would not find out for a very long time. And in the meantime, the U-boats sank ships. Chapter 4. The Happy Time, 1940 to 1941. The summer of 1940 was the beginning of something extraordinary. France had fallen. Germany held the Atlantic coast from Norway to the Spanish border. Suddenly, the U-boats, which had previously operated from bases in Germany, requiring a long transit through the North Sea and around Scotland to reach the Atlantic, had bases directly on the ocean. Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux. The transit time from base to patrol area shrank from weeks to days. The boats could spend more time at sea, more time hunting, more time killing. And there was plenty to kill. The British merchant fleet in the summer of 1940 was already stretched beyond its capacity. The country imported the majority of its food, raw materials, and fuel. The sea lanes were its arteries. Close them, and Britain would slowly die, not in a dramatic battlefield defeat, but in the quiet, grinding manner of a body slowly starved of what it needs. Dönitz understood this perfectly. He had a name for what he was trying to achieve: Tonnagekrieg, tonnage war. The goal wasn't to sink specific ships or win specific engagements. The goal was to sink ships faster than the British could replace them, to steadily reduce the total available tonnage of Allied shipping until the arithmetic became fatal, until there simply weren't enough ships left to move the food and fuel and raw materials and ammunition that Britain needed to survive. He calculated the numbers carefully. To achieve strategic effect, he needed to sink approximately 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. Sustained over a long enough period, this rate would create an irreversible deficit. Britain would not be invaded. It would simply run out of the things that keep a nation alive. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the Wolfpacks were approaching that rate. The Aces led the way. Günther Prien, who had penetrated Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sunk the battleship Royal Oak inside the Royal Navy's own main anchorage, was by now ranging freely across the Atlantic approaches, his boat's conning tower painted with a snorting bull, the emblem of the 7th U-boat flotilla. He was 27 years old and already the most famous submarine commander in Germany. Otto Kretschmer, quiet and methodical, had developed a tactic that the British struggled to counter. He penetrated inside the escort screen after dark,
surfaced among the merchant ships, and fired torpedoes at point-blank range. He did not shoot and run. He stayed, reloaded, shot again. By the end of his combat career, Kretschmer had sunk 47 ships, totaling over 273,000 tons, more than any other U-boat commander in the war. Joachim Schepke, handsome and theatrical, was the opposite of Kretschmer in personality. He wore his white captain's cap at angles that no regulation permitted, accepted every interview and every photograph, and let the propaganda ministry make of him what it wished. His tonnage was approaching Kretschmer's. His confidence was entirely unlimited. These three men, Prien, Kretschmer, and Schepke, were known in Germany as the aces of the U-boat service. Their faces appeared on magazine covers and postage stamps. Their patrols were announced on national radio. Schoolboys collected their photographs, and in the gray waters of the North Atlantic, their torpedoes were taking the British merchant fleet apart. Chapter 5. Inside Berger's World. Klaus Berger joined the U-boat service in 1940 because he had no particular desire to be shot in a field in Russia. This was not an unusual motivation. The German armed forces in 1940 offered its young men a range of equally unpleasant options: the infantry, the artillery, the armored corps, the Luftwaffe, or the Navy. Each had its own particular flavor of potential death. Berger, who was 20 years old, had grown up in Hamburg, had spent his childhood watching ships on the Elbe, and had worked briefly in a radio repair shop before the war claimed him. The Navy seemed natural. The surface fleet seemed exposed. The U-boats seemed, paradoxically, safer. They went underwater when things got dangerous, and the photographs in the newspapers showed crews looking lean and confident and alive. He trained at Pillau on the Baltic. He learned Morse code until he could receive 30 words per minute without conscious effort, the dots and dashes translating directly into letters and numbers in some chamber of his mind that operated below thought. He learned the Enigma machine, its rotors, its plugboard, its daily key change procedures. He learned how to maintain the equipment in humidity, cold, and the constant vibration of diesel engines that never quite stopped. He graduated. He was assigned to U-331, a Type 7 C-boat whose commander was a 30-year-old Oberleutnant named Friedrich Müller, a professional naval officer who had been at sea since 1933 and who ran his boat with the quiet, undemonstrative efficiency of a man who had thought carefully about how to keep his crew alive. Berger liked him immediately. Their first patrol was uneventful. They crossed the Bay of Biscay in autumn weather, rough, gray, cold, the boat rolling sickeningly in Atlantic swells that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Reached their assigned patrol area west of the British Isles, found nothing, and came home. Berger was seasick for the first 4 days and spent considerable time wondering if he had made a terrible error. The second patrol was different. On the third day at sea, Berger received a contact report from another boat, a convoy, 40 ships, headed northeast, position given. Müller called the crew to action stations. They ran on the surface toward the intercept point, diesel engines pushing them at 14 knots, watch officers on the bridge scanning the horizon. Berger stayed at his equipment, monitoring the command frequency, relaying updates as they came in from U-boat headquarters. He heard the attack begin on the radio. Contact reports from other boats, brief and cryptic in their encoded form, translating in his mind to the shape of what was happening. Boats converging, boats attacking, the convoy scattering. Müller brought them to the convoy's southern flank as the escorts were drawn north by the initial attackers. They sank 2 ships that night. The first torpedo hit a 6,000-ton tanker,
and turned the night orange for 20 miles in every direction. The second hit a freighter, and the noise it made, Berger had not been prepared for the noise, was something between a thunderclap and a groan, as if the ocean itself was registering complaint. They dove immediately when an escort's radar appeared on their detection equipment, stayed deep for 6 hours while depth charges walked across the sea above them, close enough to crack paint and break light bulbs and send every man on the boat into the particular focused stillness of people trying very hard not to make a sound. Then they came up, found the convoy scattered, attacked again, and sank one more ship before Mueller decided their torpedo load was too reduced to continue and turned for home. They returned to Lorient to a band on the pier and schnapps in the officers' mess, and a personal congratulatory telegram from Dönitz himself. Berger was 21 years old. He thought he understood the war. He did not yet understand the war. Chapter 6. The Radio Game. How the Wolfpack Communicated. The communication system that held the Wolfpack together was, in its own way, a masterpiece of operational design. At its center was U-Boat Command Headquarters, DDU, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, which maintained a continuous radio watch on frequencies assigned to the submarine service. Every U-boat at sea checked in on a regular schedule. Position reports, weather reports, contact reports, damage reports, fuel and torpedo states. The flow of information from dozens of boats scattered across millions of square miles of ocean was continuous, managed, synthesized. Dönitz and his staff used this information to build a real-time picture of the Atlantic that no individual boat commander could have. They knew where the boats were. They knew, to the extent that intelligence and decryption allowed, where the convoys were. They could identify gaps in the patrol lines, opportunities that individual commanders couldn't see, convergence points where multiple boats could be concentrated against a single target. The system worked like this. A boat on patrol sights a convoy. The radio operator, men like Berger, encodes a brief contact report using that day's Enigma key settings: position, course, speed, number of ships, number of escorts, weather conditions. He transmits this in Morse code, staying on the air for the minimum time possible, ideally under 30 seconds. BDU receives the report, decodes it, marks the position on the plotting table. Staff officers calculate where the convoy will be in 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. They identify which other boats are within intercept range. They transmit orders to those boats: rendezvous coordinates, attack timing, tactical guidance. The boats converge. The attack is coordinated. The convoy dies. Simple in concept, extraordinarily effective in practice. From 1940 through the middle of 1942, this system was essentially unbeatable. The Allies could see individual U-boats sometimes, with radar, with aircraft, with escort vigilance. But they could not see the system. They could not understand how so many boats were consistently arriving at convoy positions simultaneously, how attacks that seemed random and opportunistic were in fact precisely orchestrated from a headquarters in France. They suspected signals intelligence. They investigated. They found nothing actionable. What they were missing was the speed problem. Their high-frequency direction-finding equipment, HF/DF, nicknamed Huff Duff by its operators, could detect and locate radio transmissions. But the early versions required time, minutes to fix a bearing, and a 20-second transmission by the time the equipment was set up and the operator had noted the bearing, gave a single line of bearing, not a position fix. You needed at least 2 stations and time to triangulate accurately. 20 seconds wasn't enough. The Germans knew this.
The Germans planned around this, and for 2 years, it protected them. Chapter 7. The Convoys Fight Back. The British were not passive victims. This needs to be said clearly, because the narrative of the happy time, the string of U-boat successes, the tonnage records, the aces photographs on magazine covers, can create a false impression of a one-sided war. It was never one-sided. It was desperately, exhaustingly, viciously contested from the first day to the last. The convoy system itself was the fundamental British response to the submarine threat, and it was more effective than the casualty figures of the early war years suggest. A ship in a convoy was many times less likely to be sunk than a ship sailing independently. The concentration of targets that convoys represented was more than offset by the concentration of defenses. But the defenses had limits. The escorts in the early years were too few, too small, too poorly equipped. A convoy of 40 merchant ships might have 3 or 4 escort vessels, corvettes, destroyers, converted merchant ships pressed into military service. Against a Wolfpack of 10 or 15 submarines attacking simultaneously from multiple directions in darkness, 3 corvettes were simply not enough. The weapons available to the escorts were also limited. Depth charges were the primary anti-submarine weapon. Metal cylinders packed with high explosive, set to detonate at a predetermined depth, dropped from the stern of a ship or launched from mortars to either side. They worked if you dropped them close enough. The problem was finding the submarine precisely enough to drop them close enough. ASDIC, the Allied underwater detection system that would later be called sonar, could detect submarines when they were submerged. It sent out pulses of sound and measured the returning echo. Skilled operators could estimate range and bearing and give a ship's captain enough information to make a depth charge attack. But ASDIC didn't work on surfaced submarines. And the U-boats, especially in the early years, preferred to attack on the surface at night. On the surface they were fast, faster than most escorts at full speed, and much faster than the slow merchant ships they hunted. They were also nearly invisible in darkness, their low silhouettes almost impossible to spot by eye before they had fired and dived. The first technological answer to this problem was radar. British surface search radar, crude by later standards but functional, could detect a surfaced submarine at several miles range. Fitted to escort vessels, it allowed night patrols that could locate surfaced U-boats before they attacked. The U-boats responded. They obtained radar detection equipment, devices that could warn the crew when they were being illuminated by radar emissions, allowing them to dive before the escort closed the range. The British responded to that. The Lee light was the response. A powerful searchlight mounted under a maritime patrol aircraft. The Lee light was designed to be used in combination with radar. The aircraft would detect the surfaced submarine with radar, approach in darkness without lights, illuminate the target at the last moment with the Lee light, and attack with depth charges before the crew could react. The time between the U-boat's radar detector giving warning and the aircraft arriving was measured in seconds. Not enough time to dive, not enough time to man the anti-aircraft guns, barely enough time to understand what was happening before the depth charges were already in the water. But weapons and sensors were only part of the battle. The other part was information, and information was where everything would eventually turn. Chapter 8. Bletchley Park and the Naval Enigma. In a Victorian country house in Buckinghamshire, 40 miles northwest of London, several thousand British civilians and military personnel were doing something that, in 1940 most mathematicians would have described as impossible. They were breaking the enigma. The German military's belief in enigma security was not irrational. The mathematics of the machine were genuinely daunting. The number of possible settings for a four-rotor naval enigma was approximately 10 to the 23rd power. Even if an attacking cryptanalyst could test one setting per second, which human beings certainly could not, working through all possibilities would take longer than the age of the universe. The key insight of the Bletchley Park mathematicians, and specifically of Alan Turing, a 28-year-old who had published theoretical papers on computational mathematics before the war, and who thought about problems in ways that left his colleagues simultaneously dazzled and confused, was that you did not need to test every possible setting. You needed to exploit the machine's structure. The Enigma machine had a fundamental flaw built into its design. It could never encrypt a letter as itself. The letter A could never emerge from the machine as A. This constraint, which seemed trivial in isolation, had profound mathematical implications. It meant that any possible decryption that produced a letter encrypting itself was definitively wrong and could be eliminated immediately. Turing built on this insight to design a mechanical device, the bomb, that could rapidly test and eliminate impossible settings, narrowing the astronomical number of possibilities down to a manageable number within hours rather than millennia. But the bomb needed something else to work. It needed a crib, a piece of known plaintext that could be expected to appear in an encrypted message. If you knew that a certain message was likely to contain a certain phrase in a certain position, you could set the bomb working against that specific, expected text and dramatically accelerate the elimination process. The cribs came from many sources. Routine messages were a goldmine.
German weather reporting stations, required to transmit standardized meteorological data at the same time every day in a format that never changed, provided cribs so reliable that Bletchley Park operators called them Sillis. German operators who were lazy or overworked sometimes used the same Enigma settings for multiple messages, or started messages with predictable phrases: "Nothing to report," "Patrol completed," "Reference your message of," that could be guessed and used as cribs. And sometimes the Allies got lucky. In May 1941, HMS Bulldog captured the German weather ship München and recovered Enigma key sheets for June. In the same month, U-110 was captured after being forced to the surface by HMS Bulldog, and its Enigma machine, rotor settings, and codebooks were taken intact before the boat sank. The intelligence this provided allowed Bletchley Park to read naval Enigma traffic for much of that summer. The Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, which received the decrypts, called Ultra, and used them to route convoys away from known Wolfpack positions, began to feel the difference almost immediately. Sinkings fell. Convoys reached their destinations. The U-boats, patrolling their assigned lines, found the ocean mysteriously empty. Dönitz noticed. He suspected a security leak. He ordered investigations. He reviewed procedures. He found nothing. The Enigma, he concluded, remained secure. The empty patrol lines were a coincidence, a variation in Allied routing, good fortune for the enemy. He was wrong, and the cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, who could never reveal what they knew without compromising their greatest secret, watched him reach the wrong conclusion and said nothing. Chapter 9. The Turning Point, 1942. The year 1942 began with what looked like a second happy time.
When America entered the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the eastern seaboard of the United States became an open hunting ground.
American coastal cities had not been blacked out. Ships sailed independently, with lights, on predictable routes, in predictable conditions. U-boats ranging down the American coast found targets so abundant and so undefended that German crews called it the American shooting season, die amerikanische Schießsaison. Dönitz sent his long-range Type 9 boats to exploit it. The results were catastrophic for the Allies. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank hundreds of ships off the American coast, most of them tankers, the absolute lifeblood of the Allied war effort. The oil fires were visible from Florida beaches. Lifeboats washed ashore on American shores with the bodies of merchant sailors. The German submarine commanders who participated in this period spoke of it afterward, those who survived, as the greatest hunting of their careers. But even as they hunted, changes were accumulating. The Americans introduced the convoy system to their coastal routes. The result was immediate and dramatic. Sinkings dropped sharply. The U-boats shifted back to the mid-Atlantic, the Black Gap, where land-based aircraft from neither side could reach, the area where no air cover was available, where convoys were most vulnerable. The Wolfpacks concentrated there, and in that concentrated area, in the mid-Atlantic, between roughly 25 and 40 degrees west longitude, the decisive Battle of the Atlantic was being fought. It was in that area, and specifically in the spring of 1943, that everything changed. Chapter 10. The technology closes in. 3 technologies converged in the spring of 1943 to destroy the Wolfpack system. The first was airborne radar. The ASV Mark III, air-to-surface vessel radar, in its 3rd generation of development, was fitted to maritime patrol aircraft and escort carriers. Unlike earlier versions, the Mark III operated on centimetric wavelengths that the U-boat's standard radar detector, the METOX, could not detect. The U-boats knew they were being found, but their detection equipment was telling them the sky was clear. Boats that surfaced at night to charge batteries were being found by aircraft that gave no warning on the METOX. The aircraft appeared out of darkness, turned on their lee lights, and attacked before the crew could dive. The losses were unexplained. The explanations being offered in the U-boat service ranged from the plausible to the paranoid. Someone was leaking patrol routes. British agents in the French ports were reporting departure times and course settings. The French workers in the submarine pens were somehow communicating. The weather report transmissions were being used to locate boats. The actual explanation that a new radar was finding them was not seriously considered for months. It seemed too advanced. It was not too advanced. The second technology was the escort carrier. The critical vulnerability of the convoy system had always been the mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond the range of land-based air cover, where submarines could operate with relative impunity against surface escorts. The answer was to put the air cover on a ship. Escort carriers were converted merchant hulls with flight decks added, smaller than fleet carriers, slower, with limited aircraft complements. But they could operate in the mid-Atlantic, and the aircraft they carried, primarily swordfish biplanes equipped with radar and depth charges, could cover the areas around a convoy that surface escorts could not reach. The Wolfpack, designed to work in the air gap, suddenly found the air gap closing. Boats that dived to avoid aircraft encountered surface escorts. Boats that surfaced to evade surface escorts encountered aircraft. The sanctuary of darkness was being eliminated by Lee lights and radar. The sanctuary of submersion was being reduced by improving ASDIC and better depth charge patterns. But the third technology was the most decisive of all.
And it was the one that would make Klaus Berger's transmission that night, that brief, routine, 20-second contact report, fatal not just to his boat, but to the entire Wolfpack he was calling in. That technology was the ship-borne high-frequency direction finder, the new Huff Duff. Chapter 11. Huff Duff, the Invisible Ear. High-frequency direction finding had existed for years. Shore-based stations could detect radio transmissions and determine their bearing, and if multiple stations detected the same transmission, the bearings could be triangulated to give a position fix. The problem was always time. Shore stations were far from the action, separated by hundreds of miles. Getting multiple bearings from widely separated stations and combining them to a position fix took minutes. 20 seconds of transmission was not enough. By the time the fix was obtained, the U-boat had stopped transmitting and dived. Even a good fix was history, not a targeting solution. The U-boat service knew about shore-based Huff Duff. Their operational procedures were specifically designed around it. 20 seconds maximum. Encode and transmit and stop. Then dive or move. What they did not know, what they had not considered seriously possible, was that the direction-finding equipment could be fitted to ships. The British had been working on this problem. Fitting Huff Duff to individual escort vessels meant that a convoy could have the direction-finding capability traveling with it. Instead of depending on shore stations separated by hundreds of miles, you had 2 or 3 Huff Duff-equipped escorts, separated by just a few miles within the convoy screen, able to take simultaneous bearings the instant any transmission was detected. The separation between ships was small, too small for a precise position fix in the classical sense, but it was enough for something that proved more useful in practice, an immediate indication of the direction from which a transmission had come. If an escort detected a transmission bearing 040 degrees, it knew approximately where the transmitting submarine was. Not precisely, but approximately was enough to send an aircraft or a fast destroyer to investigate. And because the equipment was automated, the bearing appeared on a dial the moment the transmission began. The operator didn't need the submarine to stay on the air for more than a fraction of a second to get a useful reading. Not 20 seconds, not 5 seconds, 1 second. The interval between the beginning of a transmission and a useful bearing was measured in fractions of a second. The Wolfpack's fundamental operational assumption that brief transmissions were safe had just been made false, and no one in the U-boat service knew it yet. Chapter 12. May 1943, the month that broke the Wolfpack. May 1943 will be remembered in the history of naval warfare as the month the Battle of the Atlantic turned. In that single month, the Allies sank 41 German U-boats. In a single month. 41 boats, each with a crew of 40 to 50 men. More than 1,800 German sailors killed or captured in 30 days. The U-boat service called it Schwarzer Mai, Black May. Dönitz, who had built the entire Wolfpack system, who had watched it work for 3 years with devastating effectiveness, was confronted in May 1943 with casualty figures that made continued operations in the North Atlantic tactically insane. He withdrew his boats. Not permanently, not in acknowledgement of defeat. He convinced himself, or told himself, or said out loud in his headquarters, while privately believing something darker, that the losses were a temporary problem. that new technology would restore the balance, that the snorkel, which allowed boats to charge batteries while submerged, and new acoustic torpedoes and improved radar detectors would return the Wolfpack to effectiveness. None of them did. The Battle of the Atlantic continued until the last days of the war.
U-boats kept sailing. Sailors kept dying. Ships kept being sunk on both sides. But the strategic moment, the moment when Germany might have cut Britain's supply lines and changed the course of the war, that moment was gone by the summer of 1943. Gone partly because of radar. Gone partly because of escort carriers. Gone partly because of better tactics, more escorts, longer-range aircraft, and the closure of the Mid-Atlantic Gap. But gone also because of the Huff-Duff fitted to escort vessels, because of the undetectable bearing that every transmission gave away, because of the fact that the Wolfpack's greatest strength, its ability to coordinate through radio, had become its greatest vulnerability, and because of young men like Klaus Berger, who followed their training, did everything right, transmitted for exactly the time they had been told was safe, and in doing so painted a beacon in the sky that the enemy could read in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Chapter 13. What happened on the night in question? U-331 had been at sea for 18 days when she found the convoy. She had not had an easy patrol. The weather had been brutal. 6 days of North Atlantic storm that kept the boat submerged more than the captain wanted, depleting batteries, limiting range, testing the patience of a crew already stretched by the deprivations of extended patrol. They had found nothing in their assigned grid square, spent 3 days waiting for intelligence reports that hadn't come, and were beginning the calculation that defined every patrol's final phase. How much longer can we stay before fuel and torpedoes and human endurance require us to turn for home? Mueller had decided on 2 more days. On the 17th day, a message from BDU factored them toward a convoy reported by another boat 300 miles to the west. Mueller changed course. They ran on the surface in growing darkness, diesel engines pushing them at maximum speed. The watch officers on the bridge alternating every 2 hours in the cold that cut through even the heaviest leather coats. Berger was not on the bridge. He was at his equipment, maintaining the continuous radio watch that was his primary duty on patrol. He monitored the command frequency, the distress frequencies, the weather frequencies. He logged every transmission received, noted bearings and signal strengths, maintained the communications record that Mueller would review each day. It was routine. After 3 patrols, it was almost comfortable. If anything about a steel tube submerging in the North Atlantic could be called comfortable. On the 18th day, 3 hours after midnight, the lookouts spotted the convoy. It was a large one, perhaps 35 ships, maybe more, difficult to estimate in the darkness and at the range from which they first sighted it. The silhouettes of freighters and tankers lined the horizon, moving at the 7 or 8 knots that fully loaded merchant ships could manage, escorted by what the bridge officers could identify as at least 4 surface vessels. Mueller made his assessment. He called for a contact report. Berger, convoy. Position, course, speed. Prepare a contact report for transmission. Berger knew what to do. He set up the Enigma. He entered that day's key settings from the codebook. Rotors in their assigned positions, plugboard connections made, ring settings confirmed. He encoded the message. Position by grid reference. Course northeast. Speed approximately 8 knots. Merchant ships approximately 35. Escorts identified 4. Weather conditions. He checked it. He prepared to transmit.
What he did not know was that 180 miles away, the convoy's senior escort, a captain-class frigate, American-built, British-manned, fitted with one of the new shipborne Huff-Duff sets, had been listening. The operator on the escort had been on watch for 2 hours. He was 20 years old, trained in a 3-month course at a shore establishment outside Liverpool, and he had been told exactly what to expect and exactly what to do when he heard it. He had been waiting for this. The moment Berger's transmission began, the first characters of his encoded contact report, moving at Morse speed down the antenna wire into the Atlantic night. The Huff-Duff set aboard the escort gave a bearing. The bearing dial swung, settled. The operator read it. He reached for his telephone. He was talking to his captain before Berger had finished encoding the 3rd line of his message. Chapter 14. The Chain Reaction. The escort captain received the bearing at 03:12 hours. He had done this before. He knew what it meant. A U-boat was transmitting, bearing approximately 215 degrees from his position, meaning south-southwest, somewhere in the darkness ahead of the convoy's port bow. The transmission was ongoing. The Huff-Duff operator was giving him updates as the signal continued. The bearing was steady, which meant the boat was not moving quickly. He called the convoy commodore on the voice radio. The convoy, he recommended, should alter course 30 degrees to starboard, away from the bearing, while he detached to investigate. The convoy commodore agreed. The escort increased to maximum speed, heading toward the bearing. An aircraft, a swordfish from the escort carrier traveling with the convoy, was scrambled. At BDU headquarters, the contact report arrived and was decoded. Donitz's duty officer read it, marked the convoy position on the plotting table, and began identifying which other boats in the area could be vectored to the intercept. Confirmations went out. Course changes were ordered. 5 other boats in 2 adjacent grid squares began moving toward the position Berger had reported. Each of them transmitted an acknowledgement. Each acknowledgement gave a bearing to the Huff-Duff operators on the escort vessels. Each bearing built a picture. By 0400 hours, less than 50 minutes after Berger's first transmission, the convoy had altered course and was opening the range. 2 escorts were actively hunting based on Huff-Duff bearings. The swordfish from the escort carrier was airborne with radar and lee light, and 6 German submarines, none of which had yet seen the convoy and none of which knew they had been located, were converging on a position from which the convoy was already departing. Chapter 15. Berger realizes. Berger didn't know any of this. He completed his contact report, transmitted, shut down. Exactly as trained. 20 seconds, maybe 22. He logged the transmission time and noted the BDU acknowledgement that came back within minutes. He sat back at his station. The boat was still on the surface, moving carefully to maintain contact with the convoy while staying outside the range at which escort's radar could detect them. Müller was on the bridge, watching, waiting for the other boats to arrive. Standard Wolfpack procedure. An hour passed. 2 hours. Berger intercepted the transmissions from the other boats, acknowledging BDU's vector orders. He decoded them, logged them, passed the relevant content to the captain. 6 boats were coming. They would be in position before dawn. He could almost feel the convoy's presence, somewhere out there in the darkness. 35 ships moving slowly northeast, unaware of the ring of submarines tightening around them. Except the ring wasn't tightening. At 0445, a lookout on the bridge reported aircraft, a single aircraft, running without lights, approaching from the northeast. That was wrong. Aircraft coming from the convoy's direction meant the convoy knew where they were. Müller ordered a crash dive. They went deep, stayed down for 2 hours. When they came up, they could not find the convoy. Berger monitored the radio. The other boats that had been vectored in were reporting, "Convoy not found at predicted position."
One boat reported an aircraft attack. Depth charges, no damage. Another reported being hunted by surface escorts. Another reported a contact with ships, but couldn't identify them as the convoy. Might be escorts only. The convoy had moved, not randomly, systematically. They had moved away from the precise position that Berger had reported, in the direction that would put the most distance between themselves and the area his transmission had identified. Berger stared at his equipment. He had been transmitting for 22 seconds. 22 seconds was safe. Everyone knew 22 seconds was safe. And then, in the slow, terrible manner that realizations arrive when they are explaining a catastrophe, Berger understood that 22 seconds was not safe. Not anymore. Not with whatever the British had fitted to their escorts. Not with the speed at which they had responded. His transmission had not been a message sent securely to command. It had been a beacon, a location marker, a precise address given to the enemy, and he had used it to invite 6 other boats to the same address. Chapter 16. The Hunt. The next 72 hours were the worst of Berger's life. U-331 spent most of those hours submerged. Surface time was dangerous. Aircraft appeared with startling speed and frequency, and it became clear that the escort carrier with the convoy was maintaining air patrols across a radius far larger than anything they had encountered in earlier patrols. The air was there. That was the phrase that formed in Berger's mind and refused to leave. The air is theirs. On the surface, aircraft. Beneath the surface, ASDIC pinging against the hull at intervals that told them escorts were close and searching systematically. Muller drove the boat deep when the pinging strengthened, changed course constantly, managed his battery state with the cold arithmetic of a man who knew that dead batteries meant dead crew. They heard what happened to the others through intermittent radio intercepts. One of the 6 boats that had been vectored in, Berger never learned which one. The transmissions were fragmentary, and the encoding made identification difficult, sent a damage report at 0900 on the first day. Depth charges, severe damage, returning to base. Another went silent entirely around noon, a silence that meant, in the vocabulary of submarine warfare, that it would not be heard from again. By the end of the 3rd day, Berger's count of missing boats stood at 3. 3 boats, each with 40 to 50 men, each of which had been converging on the position he had reported, the position that the British had used as the center of a hunting pattern specifically designed to catch them. On the 4th day, Muller made the decision to abort the patrol. Fuel was at the level that required a return decision. Torpedoes had not been fired. There had been no opportunity for attack. The convoy was long gone, and the area was, in Muller's professional judgment, now more dangerous than productive. They surfaced briefly to transmit a patrol abort message to BDU. Berger encoded it. Prepared to transmit. He sat with his hand on the transmission key, and for the first time in his career as a naval radio operator, he hesitated. He thought about the convoy's course change, which had happened too quickly to be coincidence. He thought about the aircraft arriving from the convoy's direction, which meant the convoy had known where they were. He thought about the escorts that had appeared so quickly from such accurate bearings. He thought about his 22-second transmission. He transmitted the abort message in 11 seconds, the shortest transmission he had ever sent. He cut off the encoding mid-procedure,
shortened everything, eliminated every non-essential element. 11 seconds. He didn't know if it would make a difference. He didn't know if anything would make a difference.
But the understanding that had been forming in the back of his mind for 3 days had crystallized into something cold and specific. The British could hear them. Not just detect them, hear them, locate them. In less time than it took to complete a standard contact report. Every transmission was a death notice, not a message sent securely to command, a death notice delivered to the enemy with a precise return address. He sat back from his equipment. The diesel engines ran. The boat moved through the Atlantic, heading northeast toward Lorient, toward port, toward the schnapps and the band on the pier, and the debriefing, and the careful, professional lies that operational reality now required. Berger was 22 years old. He had just understood something that would take the U-boat service's leadership many more months and many more boats to understand. The Wolfpack's communications system, the system that made it work, that gave it its coordination and its reach, and its ability to strike from multiple directions simultaneously, was killing it. Not the enemy's weapons, not their aircraft, or their depth charges, or their radar. The radio itself. The system that made the Wolfpack a Wolfpack was the same system that was giving its position to the enemy every time it tried to function. The Wolfpack was being tracked not despite its communications, but through them. Part 2. The Science of the Hunt. How the Allies built the system that destroyed the Wolfpack. Chapter 17. The Men Who Listened. 300 miles from where U-331 was running for home, in an operations room aboard a British escort vessel, a young rating named Thomas Hennessy was completing his watch. He was 20 years old, born in Liverpool. His father had been a merchant sailor before the war, currently serving on Atlantic convoy routes and therefore, statistically, having a difficult time of it. Hennessy had joined the Navy with the specific intention of doing something about that, which had led him, by a combination of aptitude test results and the Navy's opaque assignment processes, to the Huff Duff training course, and then to this ship. He was good at it. Good in the way that some people are good at listening, not just hearing sounds, but interpreting them, feeling the shape of a signal in the moment before the bearing dial completed its movement. He had learned to distinguish the characteristic fist, the individual rhythm, of different German radio operators. They each had a style, an unconscious pattern to the way they keyed their Morse. Some were hesitant, some were precise and military, some were almost musical. The one he had been tracking tonight was young, precise, slightly rushed on the longer code groups, the tell of an operator who was well-trained but not yet fully comfortable with extended transmissions. He had noted the fist in his log. If he heard it again, he would recognize it. This was not in his training manual. It was something he had worked out for himself, in the long, empty watches when the frequency was quiet and his mind had to find something to do. He had told his chief petty officer about it, and the chief had told his commanding officer, and the commanding officer had passed it up the chain, and someone at some higher level had decided it was worth investigating systematically. The investigation was ongoing, but tonight it had given something useful already. From the first transmission, he had estimated the operator as young, trained at one of the Baltic establishments within the past 18 months, probably on a Type 7C boat, probably on his third or fourth patrol, based on the confidence level in the keying pattern. This was, of course, all speculation,
But it was the kind of speculation that, combined with the hard information from the bearing dial, was building a picture of the enemy that went beyond positions on a chart. It was building a picture of who they were. And the more clearly you could see who your enemy was, the more precisely you could anticipate where he would be, what he would do, and how long he would last. Chapter 18. Admiral Max Horton and the Western Approaches. The man responsible for defeating the Wolfpack was not a scientist or a code breaker. He was a sailor. Admiral Sir Max Horton had commanded submarines in the First World War with a combination of technical skill and ruthlessness that had made him both respected and feared in equal measure. He had once intercepted a German destroyer, torpedoed it, surfaced, and boarded it before it sank to take documents and equipment, an action of audacity that had no precedent, and, his superiors had noted with some concern, no evident regulation against it. By 1942, he was 58 years old and had spent 20 years in various staff positions that had given him a comprehensive understanding of naval warfare at every level: the tactical, the operational, the strategic, and the bureaucratic. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches in November 1942. His predecessor had fought the Battle of the Atlantic as a defensive struggle: protect the convoys, escort them safely across, measure success in ships not sunk. Horton's intention was different. He intended to hunt submarines, not just react when submarines attacked, not just escort and hope. Hunt them, find them, kill them. Make the Atlantic so dangerous for U-boats that the cost of operating exceeded any possible benefit. To do this, he built support groups. The support group concept was simple and, in retrospect, obvious. Take a group of fast escort vessels, destroyers and frigates, and remove them from the static convoy escort role. Give them no convoys to protect. Free them to move. Their sole purpose was to hunt submarines. When a convoy was attacked, when a submarine was detected by Huff Duff or aircraft or ESDIC, the support group would move to the area and stay until the submarine was dead. Not until the convoy was safe, at which point the escort had to return to its charge. Stay until the submarine was dead. This changed the psychology of the contest. Previously, a U-boat captain who had been detected could calculate that if he stayed deep long enough, was quiet enough, changed course correctly, the escort would eventually run low on fuel or depth charges or time and break off to return to its convoy. Patience and skill could save you from a counterattack. With support groups, patience was no longer enough. The hunters could stay as long as you could, and they usually had more time than you did. Chapter 19. The Operational Intelligence Center and the Submarine Tracking Room. In the basement of the Admiralty in London, in a room that did not officially exist, and whose contents were among the most tightly held secrets of the war, a small team of specialists maintained something that their German counterparts would have given almost anything to understand: the Submarine Tracking Room. The room, as its occupants called it, synthesized every piece of intelligence about U-boat locations, activities, and movements from every source available to British intelligence. Huff-duff bearings from escort vessels at sea, shore-based direction-finding networks, aircraft sighting reports, reports from escaped prisoners and neutral shipping, and most valuously, the ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park. The head of the submarine tracking room for most of the crucial period was Roger Wynne, a lawyer in civilian life, a commander by wartime rank, and one of the most remarkable analytical minds applied to any problem in the war. Wynne had contracted polio as a child and walked with a pronounced limp that had disqualified him from sea service. The Navy, in the inscrutable manner of bureaucracies, had therefore assigned him to intelligence work,
which turned out to be exactly where he was most needed. Wynne's gift was pattern recognition. He understood not just individual U-boat positions, but the logic behind their distribution, why Dönitz had placed them where he had, what tactical objective was being pursued, what the patrol line was trying to achieve. He could often predict, within a small area, where a Wolfpack would move next, not because he had intelligence saying so, but because he understood how Dönitz thought. He was, in effect, reading Dönitz's mind, and the information flowing into his room, the Huff-Duff bearings from ships at sea, the ultra-decrypts when they were available, the aircraft sighting reports, the reports of attacks and evasions, was his raw material. Every piece added to a picture that was more complete than any single source could provide. When a convoy was routed, Wynne advised on the optimal course to minimize the probability of encounter. When a Wolfpack was forming, he could sometimes identify the assembly before it was complete. When a boat transmitted a contact report, the Huff-Duff network and the tracking room combined to determine where it was within minutes. The Wolfpack's great tactical strength, its ability to concentrate force through communication, depended on those communications being secret. The submarine tracking room had removed that secrecy. The Wolfpack was being fought not just at sea, but in a London basement, by a lawyer with a limp who had spent 3 years learning to think like Karl Dönitz. Chapter 20. What Dönitz Knew and Didn't Know. Karl Dönitz was not a stupid man. He watched his boats disappear in May 1943, and he knew something fundamental had changed. He ordered his boats out of the North Atlantic, not because he had given up, but because continuing operations under current conditions was tactical suicide, and tactical suicide served no strategic purpose. He believed, or chose to believe, that the change was technological, that the British had developed new detection methods. The new radar was the primary suspect. There was evidence from recovered boat wreckage and from the testimony of the few men who survived sinkings and were rescued by Allied vessels that aircraft were attacking without radar warning. This pointed to a new radar type that the U-boat's METOX detectors couldn't pick up. He was correct about the centimetric radar. He ordered his technical staff to develop a detector that could pick up the new frequencies. He was less clear on the Huff-Duff problem. He knew the British had shore-based direction finding. He knew that extended transmissions were dangerous. His procedures already required brevity. What he did not fully grasp was that the ship-borne Huff-Duff had eliminated the minimum safe transmission time, that the 20-second rule, which had been validated by 3 years of successful Wolfpack operations, was now producing the opposite of safety. The investigations he ordered found no evidence of a cipher compromise. The conclusion he drew, that Enigma remained secure, was correct as far as it went. The traffic decryption at Bletchley Park was incomplete and intermittent. During periods when the Enigma keys were not broken, the Allies could not read the Wolfpack instructions. But by 1943, they didn't need to read the Wolfpack instructions to kill the Wolfpack. They just needed to hear the transmissions. Any transmissions. The contact reports that vectored other boats in. The acknowledgments that confirmed receipt of orders. The weather reports that every boat was required to send. The routine position updates. Every one of these, however brief, however carefully encoded, gave a bearing. Multiple bearings gave a position. A position gave an aircraft or a support group
something to work with. Dönitz's system of communication was also a system of self-location. Every time it functioned as designed, it killed another boat.
Chapter 21. The Human Cost. The numbers require context to be fully understood. The U-boat service began the war with approximately 1,000 men in its submarine crews. By the end of the war in 1945, approximately 30,000 men had served in submarines. Of those, approximately 25,000 were dead. 25,000 men dead. A fatality rate of approximately 75%. In no other branch of the armed forces of any nation in the Second World War, not the Japanese kamikaze pilots, not the crews of the early American heavy bombers, not the Soviet penal battalions, not the infantry on any front, was the probability of death as high as in the German U-boat service. 3 out of every 4 men who served in submarines did not come home. Among those who served in the critical period of 1943 and beyond, the rate was higher. These were not men who had been misled about the dangers. By 1943, every man who climbed down the hatch of a U-boat and sealed it behind him understood what the statistics were saying. They had watched friends leave on patrol and not return. They had seen the telegrams delivered to families in Hamburg and Bremen and Kiel. They had sat in the officers' mess in Lorient and watched the empty chairs accumulate. They went anyway. Some went because they had no choice. The German military justice system was not lenient with men who refused orders. Some went because the culture of the U-boat service, the identity of it, the brotherhood of it, made leaving feel like a form of death worse than the one waiting at sea. Some went because they were 20 years old, and 20-year-olds are not fully equipped to process statistical probability against personal immortality. And some went because they genuinely believed in what they were doing, believed the war was right or necessary or winnable, believed the sacrifices of their crewmates demanded continuation, believed that the stop was to make meaningless every man who had already died.
Klaus Berger was not in any of these categories precisely. He was something more complicated. A man who had understood something terrible, who carried that understanding with him on every subsequent patrol, and who went anyway, because the alternative, and he had examined the alternative carefully in the long, dark hours of deep submersion while depth charges walked across the sea above him, was unacceptable to him in ways he could not entirely explain. He was not a hero in any theatrical sense. He was something quieter and more difficult to name. A man doing his job in full knowledge of what his job was costing. That is its own kind of courage, or its own kind of tragedy. It is, perhaps, both. Chapter 22. After Black May. After Dönitz pulled his boats from the North Atlantic in May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic continued, but its character had fundamentally changed. The Wolfpack, as a strategic instrument, was broken. The Germans experimented with solutions. The Schnorkel, a retractable air mast that allowed diesel engines to run while the boat was submerged, removed the requirement to surface for battery charging. Surfacing had been the period of greatest vulnerability. On the surface, a boat could be detected by radar, found by Huff-Duff bearing, attacked by aircraft. The Schnorkel allowed boats to remain submerged almost indefinitely, but Schnorkel-equipped boats were slower submerged than surfaced. Their range and speed were reduced, and the Wolfpack tactic, concentrating multiple boats against a convoy through coordinated movement and communication, still required communication, and communication still gave bearings. New torpedo types were introduced. The T-5 acoustic torpedo, called Zaunkönig, Wren, by the Germans, and GNAT by the Allies, homed on propeller noise. It was designed to kill escort vessels, not merchant ships, attack the guards, and the flock was unprotected. The T-5 had some successes in the autumn of 1943. The Allies developed a countermeasure, a noisemaker towed behind the ship that attracted the torpedo away from the hull with remarkable speed. The pattern was consistent throughout the second half of the war. The Germans introduced a new capability. The Allies analyzed it, developed a counter, and deployed the counter within months. The technological initiative had passed to the Allied side completely. New boat types were developed. The Type 21 U-boat, a revolutionary design with far greater battery capacity and underwater speed, was the answer to many of the tactical problems that had destroyed the Wolfpack. If it had entered service in sufficient numbers in 1942 or even 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic might have had a different outcome. It entered service in April 1945. The war in Europe ended 1 month later. The Type 21 was too late by approximately 2 years. And the reasons for that, the production delays, the Allied bombing of German industry, the administrative failures, the competing priorities in the German war economy, are a separate story. What matters here is that by the time the improved technology arrived, the strategic situation was irretrievable. The Allied supply lines across the Atlantic were secure. The industrial output they supported, the tanks and aircraft and ammunition and food and fuel flowing from North America to Britain and then to the fronts, had reached levels that no conceivable submarine campaign could disrupt. The Wolfpack had failed. Not because its concept was wrong. The concept was sound. It had worked for 3 years and come close to achieving its strategic objective in 1942. It failed because the enemy adapted faster than the Germans did. Because the Allies' investment in technology, intelligence, and operational analysis had built a system that could find, fix, and kill submarines faster than they could be built and crewed. And because, at the heart of it,
The Wolfpack's dependence on radio communication had been turned into a fatal vulnerability by a technology that Donitz's system had never seriously considered. A small, automated direction-finding set fitted to an escort frigate that could give a bearing from a transmission lasting less than 1 second. Chapter 23. The Enigma Finally Broken. The full story of Enigma and its role in the Battle of the Atlantic can now be told because the secret was finally declassified in the 1970s, 3 decades after the war ended. What the documents revealed was more complex than the simple narrative of "we broke their codes" suggests. The Bletchley Park operation against naval Enigma was intermittent, difficult, and frequently interrupted. The Germans periodically improved their procedures, changed their rotor selection systems, or introduced new codebooks that temporarily made the traffic unreadable. During blackout periods, which sometimes lasted months, the submarine tracking room had to operate without Ultra, relying on Huff Duff, aircraft sightings, and Roger Wynn's analytical intuition. The fact that convoy routing continued to improve even during Enigma blackout periods demonstrates that Ultra was not the only weapon in the Allied arsenal. It was enormously valuable when available. But the system that defeated the Wolfpack was larger than any single component. What the documents also revealed was the extraordinary discipline with which the ultra-secret was protected. Convoys were sometimes allowed to be attacked. Men were allowed to die, rather than route around a threat in a way that would suggest to the Germans that their communications had been compromised. The knowledge that the Enigma was broken was more valuable than any individual convoy or any individual ship. This is the cold mathematics of intelligence work in wartime.
Every decision involves a trade-off. Every secret kept costs something. The men who made those decisions, who watched convoys route into the path of wolfpacks they could have warned, who kept silent while ships were sunk and men drowned in the North Atlantic, carried those decisions for the rest of their lives. They had concluded correctly that revealing the secret would cost more lives than it saved in any single instance. That conclusion was arguably right. It was also, arguably, unbearable. Chapter 24. The Radio Operators. In the history of the Battle of the Atlantic, the U-boat commanders received the attention. Prien, Kretschmer, Schepke, the aces whose tonnages and exploits filled the propaganda pages. Dönitz himself, whose memoirs and post-war testimony shaped how the campaign was understood for decades. The radio operators are largely invisible in this history. They should not be. The men who sat at the Morse keys and the Enigma machines, who encoded the contact reports and transmitted the weather data and acknowledged the vectoring orders, were the nervous system of the Wolfpack. Without them, the system could not function. Without their transmissions, there was no coordination. Without coordination, there was no Wolfpack. Without the Wolfpack, there was no threat to the Allied supply lines. And without their transmissions, there was nothing for the Huff-Duff to hear. The radio operators were the link between Dönitz's operational concept and its execution. They were also, unknowingly, the link between the Wolfpack's position and the Allied hunters. Every time they did their job, they were simultaneously enabling the Wolfpack and destroying it. This is not a criticism of them. They followed their training. They used the procedures they had been given. They took every precaution they had been taught to take. The precautions were insufficient. But the men who taught those precautions had not known they were insufficient.
The operational security procedures for U-boat radio communications had been designed around the best available understanding of enemy direction-finding capabilities that the enemy had quietly superseded. The radio operators were not victims of their own mistakes. They were victims of a gap in intelligence that their commanders failed to close. Chapter 25. Berger's Final Patrols. Klaus Berger completed 4 more patrols after the night he transmitted the contact report. He was not transferred. He was not disciplined. Nothing he had done was operationally wrong by the standards that existed. His captain's after-action report made no mention of the contact report or its possible role in the convoy's evasion. The loss of 3 boats in the area was attributed in the operational analysis to the new Allied radar and improved air cover. Berger kept his understanding to himself. He had tried, once, to articulate what he suspected to the boat's navigation officer, a cautious man named Hoffman, who had the patient manner of someone who had spent too long in confined spaces with too many people. Hoffman had listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then said, "You should put this in writing. Make it a formal observation." Berger had not put it in writing. He could not have explained exactly why. Partly it was the instinct of an enlisted man not to question the systems his superiors had designed. Partly it was the awareness that his evidence was circumstantial, a convoy course change, aircraft arriving from the wrong direction, 3 boats that might have been lost for any number of reasons. Partly it was the possibility, which he could not dismiss, that he was wrong, that 22 seconds really was safe, and he had simply been unlucky. He kept the suspicion. He shortened his transmissions on every subsequent patrol. 11 seconds, 9 seconds. On one occasion, 7,
a transmission so brief that BDU's acknowledgement asked him to repeat because the message had been received incomplete. He repeated it. 13 seconds. He came home from each patrol. Not every boat he had served with came home. By early 1944, the casualty rate in the U-boat service had reached the level where new boats were going out with crews who had received minimal training, men who had been given months instead of years in the Baltic training areas, who had not had time to develop the skills and the instincts that the earlier generation had built over years of operational experience. Berger, who had 4 patrols behind him by this point, was considered a veteran. He was 23 years old. Chapter 26. The Strategic Failure and Its Causes. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest campaign of the Second World War. It began on the first day of the conflict and ended on the last. It was fought across an area larger than all the land battles of the war combined. It involved hundreds of thousands of men on both sides and consumed resources, ships, aircraft, weapons, fuel, and above all, human lives, on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Germany lost. The reasons are multiple and interconnected and have been analyzed in thousands of books and papers and dissertations over the 80 years since the war ended. But at their core, the failure of the Wolfpack came down to a simple, structural problem that Dönitz never fully resolved. The Wolfpack's tactical strength and its strategic vulnerability were the same thing. The Wolfpack was powerful because it communicated. Multiple boats, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, could be concentrated against a single target in hours, because Dönitz could reach all of them simultaneously by radio. The convoy that one boat found became the target of 10 boats, because the radio told 10 boats where it was. But communication required transmission. Transmission required radiation of radio energy.
Radiated radio energy could be detected, and its source located. And once the Allies had built the technology to locate that source quickly enough, on ships, close enough to the action to act on the information immediately, the Wolfpack's communications became its primary vulnerability. Dönitz could not solve this problem. He could reduce transmission times. He did. He could improve encryption. He did. He could vary frequencies. He did. None of it was enough, because the problem was not with the content of the transmissions or the encryption of the messages or the length of time spent on the air. The problem was more fundamental. The problem was that the electromagnetic energy of any transmission, however brief, however well encoded, propagated at the speed of light across the ocean and could not be made to travel only to its intended recipient. Physics did not respect operational security. And the Allies, who had understood this earlier and had built better tools to exploit it, won the radio war before the submarine war was decided. Chapter 27. The Lessons. The Battle of the Atlantic produced lessons that resonated through every subsequent conflict involving submarines, communications security, and signals intelligence. The first and most fundamental lesson was this: any communications system that requires frequent transmission in a hostile electromagnetic environment is a security liability that cannot be fully mitigated by encryption alone. Encryption protects content. It cannot protect the fact of transmission. It cannot prevent direction finding. It cannot prevent traffic analysis, the study of who is communicating with whom, how often, in what volume, at what times, which can reveal operational patterns even when the content of the messages remains unread. The Wolfpack's Enigma traffic, even when completely unbroken, was still a source of intelligence because the volume, frequency, timing, and bearing of transmissions told the Allies things about Wolfpack concentration and activity that had operational value. The second lesson was about adaptation speed. In the Battle of the Atlantic, both sides introduced new technologies regularly. The decisive factor was not who introduced the best technology, but who adapted fastest to the other side's innovations. The Allies adapted faster. They had better scientific establishments, better integration of technical expertise into operational planning, better feedback mechanisms between frontline experience and technical development. The German technical response to Allied innovations was consistently slower. Not because Germany lacked scientists or engineers, it had many of extraordinary capability, but because the organizational culture was less receptive to technical challenge and less efficient at translating technical insight into operational change. The third lesson was about the danger of systems that become their own vulnerability. The Wolfpack was a system. Its components, the boats, the crews, the communications, the command structure, the cipher machines, worked together to create a capability greater than any individual element. When one component of that system became a vulnerability, the entire system was affected, because all the other components depended on the compromised one. The radio was the compromised component, and because everything else, the coordination, the concentration, the tactical effectiveness, depended on the radio, everything else was compromised when the radio was compromised. This lesson was not lost on the military establishments that studied the Battle of the Atlantic after the war. Submarine communications changed fundamentally. New technologies, burst transmission, very low frequency, eventually satellite communications, were designed from the beginning with the vulnerability of direction finding in mind. But the underlying physics remained unchanged. Transmit, and you can be found. That was true in 1943. It is true today. Chapter 28. What became of Berger? Klaus Berger survived the war. This was statistically remarkable. He completed 7 operational patrols in total, 3 before Black May, 4 after. He was depth-charged on 3 occasions, once severely enough that the boat required 3 months of repairs before it could return to service. He lost colleagues on every patrol, boats that had been part of the same flotilla, men he had eaten with and worked alongside, whose Morse fist he knew as well as their faces. He was on his 7th patrol when the war ended in May 1945. He returned to Germany to find a country that had been comprehensively destroyed. Hamburg, where he had grown up, was a landscape of rubble and ruin, the result of the firestorm raids of 1943 and subsequent Allied bombing. His family had survived. Others in his street had not. He spent several years in the immediate post-war period doing what most survivors of the U-boat service did, rebuilding in the most literal sense, clearing rubble, finding work, trying not to think about certain things too often. He was interviewed by the British Naval Intelligence Team that conducted post-war assessments of U-boat operations in 1947. He told them, among other things, about the night he had transmitted the contact report, about the course change the convoy had made, about his growing suspicion that brief transmissions were no longer safe. The British interviewer, a young lieutenant commander who had spent the war in the submarine tracking room, listened carefully and made detailed notes. Then he told Berger that yes, the shipborne Huff Duff had been operational since early 1942, that contact reports were being fixed within seconds of the first character, that the convoy's course change on the night in question had been based directly on the bearing his transmission had provided. Berger sat with this information for a long time, without speaking.
Then he asked, "When did your Admiral Dönitz know about the shipborne equipment?" The British officer said, "We don't believe he ever fully understood it. He attributed the losses primarily to the new airborne radar." Berger was quiet again. Then he said, very carefully, "He didn't know what was killing us." The British officer said, "No." Berger nodded. He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. "If we had known," he said, "we would have stopped transmitting. We would have found another way to coordinate." The British officer said, "Yes, you might have." Neither of them said what this implied. They did not need to. Chapter 29. The Meaning of the Battle. The Battle of the Atlantic was decided in the end, not on the surface of the ocean or in the depths below it. It was decided in the laboratories, where centimetric radar was developed, in the operations rooms, where convoys were routed, in the basement of the Admiralty, where Roger Wynne read Huff-Duff bearings and Enigma decrypts and built a picture of the Wolfpack that no individual boat could see, in the training establishments, where Huff-Duff operators were taught to fix a bearing from a fraction of a second transmission, in the escort carrier operations rooms, where aircraft were launched and briefed and sent into the darkness over the Atlantic. It was decided by the accumulated weight of a scientific, industrial, and organizational effort that dwarfed anything the Wolfpack could put against it. Karl Dönitz had built a magnificent tactical instrument. The Wolfpack was genuine innovation, a new form of naval warfare that had never existed before, and that achieved effects far beyond what the individual submarines could have achieved operating independently. But he had built it against an enemy that had learned, from the earliest days of the war, that the only way to defeat the Wolfpack was not to match it at the tactical level, but to undermine it at the systemic level.
Find the communication system, understand how it works, build the tools to exploit it, destroy the system from the inside. The Wolfpack died because its communications system became the means of its destruction. Klaus Berger's 22-second transmission on a dark night in the North Atlantic was a small and entirely typical event in the larger story. He did nothing wrong. He did everything he had been trained to do. He transmitted briefly, encoded securely, and stopped. And in those 22 seconds, the bearing was fixed, the convoy course was changed, and 6 boats converging on the position he had reported were met by aircraft and destroyers who knew exactly where to look. He was not exceptional. He was representative. Every radio operator who transmitted a contact report, every boat that acknowledged a vectoring order, every weather station that sent its daily report into the Atlantic frequencies, they were all, unknowingly, doing the same thing, telling the enemy where they were. 22 seconds, less than 22 seconds, sometimes as little as 1. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in the silent interval between a radio key depressed and a bearing dial settling. In that fraction of a second, repeated thousands of times across 3 years of war, the Wolfpack's fate was decided, not by the weapons, by the silence that should have followed the last transmission, but never came. Part 3. The Voices from the Deep. Testimonies, Reflections, and the Long Shadow of Black May. Chapter 30. Survivors. The men who survived the U-boat service rarely spoke about it easily. This is documented in interviews conducted by naval historians in the decades after the war. Patient, respectful conversations with old men who had been very young men once, in a war that had taken from them something that they could only describe in approximations. Their crewmates, their youth,
their ability to sleep without hearing certain sounds. What they described, consistently, was not the fear, though the fear was present and acknowledged, but the intimacy of it. 40 men in a steel cylinder for weeks at a time, sharing the same air, the same food, the same sounds, the same silences, learning to know each other in the way that only extreme proximity and shared danger produces. The radio operator knowing the navigator's breathing patterns, the cook knowing which men would joke before a dive and which would go quiet, the captain knowing, without asking, when his engineer was at the edge of his endurance. This intimacy made the losses almost unbearable. When a boat didn't come home, it wasn't an abstraction. It wasn't a unit identifier on a chart or a number in a casualty report. It was 40 specific human beings whose specific habits and specific voices and specific ways of being in the world were now simply absent. One veteran, interviewed in Bremen in 1978, described coming into port after a patrol and seeing the pier where another boat from his flotilla should have been tied up, and the pier being empty. "You stand there," he said, "and you look at the empty space where the boat should be. And you think about the men who were in that space. And you understand for the first time what the empty space means. Not the death. You know about the death. You have known about the death from the beginning. But the empty space, the specific absence where specific people should be." He stopped. The interviewer waited. "You go back to your boat," he said finally, "and you check in. You go to sleep, and the next morning you do your duties, and you prepare for the next patrol." The interviewer asked, "Why?" The old man looked at him for a long moment. "Because what else is there?" he said. "Because the alternative is the empty space becoming you." Chapter 31. What the Records Say. The archives tell the story in a different register. U-Boat Command War Diaries, BDU Operational Logs, Flotilla Records, Individual Boat Patrol Reports. The Bletchley Park Files, declassified in the 1970s. The Admiralty's Submarine Tracking Room Records. The Huff Duff Intercept Logs from individual escort vessels, thousands of them, hundreds of pages each, bearing records and signal classifications and operators' annotations. What the archives show, when read together, is a system meeting a counter-system. Two organizations on opposite sides of an ocean, each trying to understand the other completely enough to destroy it. The Germans had the initial advantage. Their Wolfpack concept was new. Their Enigma security was genuine, for a time. Their early tactical successes reflected real innovation. The Allies had the institutional advantage. Their science was better organized. Their intelligence was better synthesized. Their feedback between operations and technology was faster and more systematic. The archives show this playing out in specific, granular detail. In January 1942, the average time between a U-boat transmission and an Admiralty routing order based on that transmission's bearing was between 4 and 6 hours. Useful, but not lethal. The U-boat might be 20 miles from its transmission position by the time the routing order reached the convoy. By June 1943, the average time between a U-boat transmission and a shipborne Huff Duff bearing being acted upon by an escorting vessel was less than 4 minutes. The escort could move toward the bearing. The aircraft could be launched. The support group could be called. 4 minutes against 20 miles. That was the measure of how far the Allies had come. In 18 months, they had reduced the response time from hours to minutes. In the same period, the U-boat service's transmission procedures had changed by approximately 3 seconds, 25 seconds to 22 seconds. The gap between the two sides' adaptations was the gap between survival and destruction.
Chapter 32. The Last Patrols. The U-boats kept sailing until the last week of the war. This requires explanation because by any rational calculation of military utility, the submarine campaign should have been abandoned long before May 1945. The loss rates were catastrophic. The sinkings achieved were strategically insignificant, nowhere near the tonnage required to affect Allied supply chains. The resources consumed in building and crewing new boats could have been more usefully directed elsewhere. The explanation is partly ideological. Hitler and the Nazi leadership were committed to a doctrine of Endkampf, the final battle, which required every arm of the military to continue regardless of cost. Surrender was ideologically impermissible until the physical destruction of the state made it unavoidable. The explanation is partly organizational. The U-boat service had its own culture, its own identity, its own internal logic that continued operating because stopping was not something it knew how to do. Karl Donitz had built not just a tactical system, but a psychological one, a community of men who defined themselves by their willingness to go out despite everything. And the explanation is partly human. The individual men who sailed in 1944 and 1945 were not calculating strategic utility. They were following orders, serving with their crewmates, trying to survive, trying to do what they had been trained to do in a context that had made that training largely obsolete. The last U-boat patrols of the war were an exercise in futility, conducted with extraordinary courage by men who deserved a better cause and a better command. They did not get either. Chapter 33. Donitz's Legacy. Karl Donitz outlived almost everyone in this story. He was appointed Hitler's successor as head of state in the dictator's final testament, served in that capacity for approximately 3 weeks, oversaw the German surrender, and was then tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted of crimes against peace and war crimes, the latter relating primarily to the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He served the full term. He was released in 1956. He wrote his memoirs, 10 Years and 20 Days, a title that referred both to his decade in command of the submarine service and his decade in prison. The memoirs were, characteristically, precise, professional, and largely concerned with operational and technical matters. They revealed a man who had spent 50 years thinking carefully about tactics, and very little time thinking about the human beings those tactics had destroyed. He lived until 1980. He was 89 years old when he died, outliving most of the men he had commanded by decades. His reputation among former U-boat crew members was complex. Some revered him, the precise, demanding father figure who had built their service into something great. Others had complicated feelings that they rarely expressed in his presence, but sometimes expressed in interviews after his death. That he had sent them out knowing the odds, had maintained the fiction of viability long after the actual numbers made it untenable, and had never fully reckoned with the scale of what that had cost. 25,000 men dead. Donitz, in his memoirs and his public statements, spoke of them with what appeared to be genuine grief. He called them his sons. He said the losses were the greatest burden he had carried. He did not, in any public statement that survives, fully engage with the possibility that better intelligence,
faster adaptation to the Huff-Duff threat, earlier understanding of what the radio transmissions were costing, might have reduced those losses significantly. Perhaps he did not know. Perhaps he preferred not to know. The archives do not answer that question. Chapter 34. The Memorial. At the Marine Ehrenmal in Lebow, on the Baltic coast north of Kiel, there is a memorial to the German naval dead of both world wars. Inside the monument, which was completed before the Second World War, but extended afterward to accommodate its vastly larger casualty list, there is a crypt. The crypt contains the names of German sailors who died at sea, an enormous number of names carved in stone, organized by theater and by year. The U-boat section is the largest. Visitors who come to the memorial sometimes note the same thing, the sheer repetition of the dates: 1943, 1943, 1943, 1944, 1944, 1944. Year after year, month after month, boats going out and not coming home, crews dying in the cold water or the burning oil or the sealed steel of a boat that had gone too deep. The names are not famous names. They are the names of men from Hamburg and Kiel and Bremen and Cologne and small towns in Saxony and Bavaria, whose families received telegrams with the standard language. In the performance of his duty, your son/husband/brother gave his life for Germany. Below each name, typically, 2 dates: a birthday, a day of death. Between the 2 dates, a life, a specific, particular, unrepeatable human life, with everything that implies: a childhood, a family, a set of habits and preferences and relationships, a way of laughing, a way of being afraid, a way of getting through the hours in a steel cylinder in the Atlantic, while the ship above them hunted. A radio operator who shortened his transmissions and wondered if it made any difference. The memorial does not tell you whether it made a difference. The archives, if you look carefully enough, tell you that it did not. 22 seconds, 20 seconds, 11 seconds, 7. The bearing was fixed before the first character had completed its arc through the Atlantic night. Epilogue. The message that changed everything. The message that Klaus Berger transmitted on that dark night in the North Atlantic in 1943 was, in itself, unremarkable. A convoy position, a course, a speed.
An estimate of ships and escorts: 22 seconds. Standard procedure. There was nothing wrong with it. That was the point. There was nothing wrong with the message, nothing wrong with the procedure, nothing wrong with the training that had produced the procedure. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. The system was just wrong. Not tactically wrong. The contact report was accurate. The information was useful. The coordination it enabled was exactly what the Wolfpack required. Wrong at a deeper level. The assumption on which the system's security rested, that brief transmissions could not be quickly located, had been invalidated by technology. The Allies had closed the gap. They had done it quietly, systematically, without announcement. They had fitted direction-finding sets to escort vessels and trained operators and integrated the bearings into convoy routing and support group dispatch. They had built a system that exploited the Wolfpack's greatest strength and turned it into a fatal vulnerability. And they had done it without the Germans knowing. Not because the Germans were stupid or careless or negligent, because this is how intelligence works in war. The side that understands its own vulnerabilities
and the other side's capabilities, that adapts faster and thinks more clearly about what it doesn't know, that side wins. The Battle of the Atlantic was won not in the depths of the ocean. It was won in the fraction of a second between a radio key depressed and a bearing dial settling. In that fraction of a second, 25,000 German sailors' fates were sealed. In that fraction of a second, the merchant shipping that kept Britain alive made another crossing. In that fraction of a second, the war turned, not with a battle, not with a great victory or a decisive engagement, with a bearing, with a young man's finger lifting from a radio key in the darkness, with silence, the silence that came too late.
After the bearing was already fixed, after the convoy had already altered course, after the aircraft were already scrambling from the escort carrier's deck. With the moment Klaus Berger understood that everything he had been taught about safety was wrong, that 22 seconds was not safe, that nothing was safe, that the Atlantic, which had once belonged to them, now listened for them, and when it heard them, it told the enemy exactly where to look.